Well, thank you, Greg, and congratulations to what used to be the Murphy Institute, now the School of Labor and Urban Studies. That's a great accomplishment, and your leadership is. We need SLU more than ever, given the state of the city, the labor movement, the nation. So I'm always happy to be here. I might go a little long. I thought I would start earlier. Okay. Paula runs a tight ship. I don't know if you know, but Paula's tight. So why is economic democracy needed? What is the problem with capitalism? Let's start here. And I'd like to discuss capitalism in a twofold way in terms of the theory and the practice of capitalism. Hardly anyone reads the theory of capitalism. The general theory argues that talented elites, entrepreneurs, and investors competing with one another will come up with inventions and make businesses ever more productive and efficient. The ones who are not inventive and efficient will go out of business. That's one. Second, businesses will limit what they pay workers to increase profits. But here comes the tricky part. Even though workers' wages are less than what they could be in the short run, and even though investors and entrepreneurs are motivated by greed, the push for higher profits and productivity in the end will produce so much surplus that there will be more goods available at cheap prices so that everyone, including workers, will be better off. That's the theory. And it's condensed, obviously. There are major assumptions in this theory. One is that entrepreneurs and investors who are admittedly motivated by greed will somehow flip their personalities and share the benefits of greater surplus with workers and society as a whole. Nearly all of the early criticism of capitalism, starting some 200 years ago, focused on what a bad deal capitalism is for workers, who were presumed to be white men back then. And this same critique is the bread and butter of the labor movement even to this day. But another equally important assumption in the theory is that some people who do not work in a place of business that produces goods will raise children, make dinner, take care of the sick and elderly, wash the clothes, and clean house. Without this reproductive work, which has never been profitable in a market sense, humanity doesn't survive. The early assumption was that women would do this work for free, or slaves would do it. Today, it's undocumented workers who are expected to do this work for next to nothing. But what if women don't want to be dependent on their husbands? What if ex-slaves and undocumented workers and women want to be citizens too, with the same opportunities and rights as white male workers? When we look at the practice of capitalism historically, we can see how these dynamics played out. Number one, capitalist enterprises have historically been indifferent, if not outright opposed to democracy. In some countries, workers have fought for greater voice on the job, but business usually fights this. For example, recently Amazon's CEO, Jeff Bezos, was quoted saying that he wouldn't even consider allowing unionization on his distribution plant in Staten Island. Bezos' comment is aristocratic talk, reminiscent of slavery. The United States was founded on the idea of eliminating aristocracy. That's why we have a democracy. In America, citizens can go to church or a mosque or a temple of their choice. Citizens can join a glee club and sing any songs they want. And if citizens on the job decide they want to join a union, it is their democratic right to do so. But you can see how this kind of a democratic attitude conflicts with the arrogance of power that capitalism enables. In this country, capitalism grew on the back of slavery and women's free labor and the forcible seizure of land and, frankly, genocide against Native Americans. It took a civil war and 700,000 lives to defeat slavery. And you should remember that plantations were capitalist enterprises. That should tell us something. Capitalism is thriving in China right now, and in many other countries where workers and citizens have few rights. Right now, a lot of businesses are supporting Trump, who, in my opinion, is not a friend of democracy. Second, the struggle of slaves, of colonized people, and of women have been more explosive and destabilizing for capitalism than unions ever have been. The European and US white male industrial proletariat that Marx thought would lead the world in humane sentiment and revolutionary spirit did neither, mainly due to racism and patriarchy. The prospect that white workers and black people might link up together has long been the #1 nightmare scenario for capitalism. That is why we got racial segregation for 100 years in America after the Civil War, to literally physically separate blacks and whites so they could not organize together. And for those of you who follow history, segregation was enacted during the populist movement, when poor whites and blacks started coming together. They ran a candidate for president in 1896. They took over the legislature of North Carolina and Georgia. It was a threatening movement. That's when racial segregation was instituted. And the NAACP in 1954, the lawyers for the NAA, when they filed Brown versus Board of Ed to desegregate public schools, go back and read the brief they wrote. They said segregation was instituted to divide poor white and poor black people. That's why we have to integrate schools. They put it in the context of a movement of history and of what I'm talking about right here. We are so divided that even our histories and identities are segregated. The story of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman isn't just black history, it's a labor history. The fight against slavery wasn't just about race, it was about labor. Slavery was a labor system. I can assure you that black people who worked 250 years without a paycheck firmly understood that slavery was a labor issue. Slavery undermined the dignity, power, and rights of all workers. Slavery made our democracy weak and unstable, mainly because it separated poor white folks from black and colored people. To this day, we put black history and labor history in separate boxes, even though we've all been fighting for the same thing. When you go back and read the debates over the 13th Amendment, and I encourage you to do so, you will see that the idea of workers owning no property and being forced to work for an employer just to survive was considered at the time what they called wage slavery or involuntary servitude. Way back then, that's what they called it. The Civil War and the 13th Amendment which outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude, was fought for by abolitionists not just to free black people from slavery. They wanted to make sure that no workers would ever lack what we would now call a living wage. Martin Luther King was a labor leader, not just a black leader. He was a labor leader. Martin Luther King died supporting a sanitation strike of workers in Memphis. King said to the AFL-CIO in 1962, "If you desegregate unions, I will bring the civil rights movement into the labor movement. We don't need two movements fighting for the same thing. And I'll bring 40 million black people into the labor movement, and we will have so much power, we will change America." He said this in 1962. Only 4 of 72 unions supported Martin Luther King. Only 4 of 72. Martin Luther King said, "If the Negro wins, labor wins." Implication, if the Negro loses, labor loses. What is labor now, 6%? Density? King was right. King was a labor leader. They weren't listening. King said, "Building a truly equitable society demands a structural transformation in America, in the economy, and in society so that care workers and domestic workers and sanitation workers," and we have a care worker leader right here, "who are disproportionately women and people of color, and that outcast group called white trash are uplifted." This means we have to fight for organizations, including our own unions or our own cooperatives or our own community groups, to not just look out for themselves or look out for their own members, but to fight for the people who are left out. This is the spirit of humanity and cooperation that capitalist ideology, which is about self-interest above all, and by the way, labor says we're about self-interest too. Ideologically, they are no different. In the US, they've adopted, that is their mantra. That ideology sucks humanity dry. Third, historically, business owners and investors have not voluntarily shared the wealth. And they are using their exorbitant wealth right now to take away our democracy. I don't think I need to explain this here, so I'm not going to go more into that. We are actually a rich country, $100 trillion in household wealth last year, richest country in human history. But you wouldn't know it looking at our infrastructure or looking at the number of hungry and homeless people that we have. The mayor likes to say, there's plenty of money that's just in the wrong hands. So when I'm asked, why do we need economic democracy? My short answer is that we needed to hold on to democracy. We needed to cultivate our humanity. But I want to discuss economic democracy like we just did with capitalism, theory and historical practice. The theory was expounded early on in America by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They believed every citizen ought to own land, or if they worked in a business, workers ought to own a share of it. And there were vigorous debates amongst themselves with people like Lafayette and Thomas Paine over, well, doesn't that mean you have to end slavery? Doesn't that mean women have to have the right to vote? They were debating those issues then. But their thinking was workers needed, farmers, people needed to own property so that they, and if they are in a business, own a part of the business so that they were stakeholders on the job. And they would learn how to calculate, think for themselves, and take responsibility for their decisions. Every day, on the job. The economy, in their view, was a necessary training ground for political democracy. Without this, Jefferson and Madison thought that political democracy wouldn't really be a democracy except in name, because workers would not know how to advance their interest. One of the clearest statements of economic democracy in my mind came from John Stuart Mill, writing around 1848. Mill said, "We considered the problem of society to be how to unite the greatest individual liberty of action with a common ownership in the raw material of the globe and an equal participation of all in the benefits of combined labor." That's John Stuart Mill. Socialist ideas arrived around the same time, but they didn't differ much from Mill. Their differences were more about how to than differences in principles. The big divide among socialists emerged when, after a second French Revolution in 1848, French voters who had just won universal voting rights in France, voted down socialist initiatives. This caused turmoil in the socialist movement. On the one side, some argued that socialists need strategies to educate the public, to wean workers away from following their church leaders and newspapers that had opposed not only socialism, but opposed democracy, so that workers would be willing to vote for socialism. And this began a rift between socialists and religion that lasted to today. People in this camp became closely aligned with economic democracy advocates, and eventually they became what we now call social democrats. A difference between the strain that calls themselves economic democrats and traditional social democrats is that social democracy became very focused in Europe on winning elections, and they tended to water down their messages so that they could attract more conservative voters and win elections. Kind of like what Bill Clinton did to the Democratic Party. People more identified with economic democracy tended to stay closer to their base in working class communities, focusing more on building local democratic participation in the economy through things like cooperatives, local currencies, and other local initiatives. The major divide, however, was with the other part of the socialist movement that is more identified with Marx and also with anarchism. These more radical and impatient socialists said you can't wait on the masses of people to understand socialism. You should seize power wherever you see an opportunity and bring the people along later. The Russian, Chinese, and Cuban revolutions followed this latter path. What can we say about their practices looking back over time? The Russians, Chinese, and Cubans built powerful state bureaucracies. Sometimes they did really good things. Sometimes they did really bad things. But none of them instituted democracy. The Social Democrats focused on using the ballot box to tame some of the worst evils of capitalism, pushing through programs like free and universal public and higher education, universal health care, and Social Security. All of these were originally socialist ideas. Some capitalist countries were pushed further down this road than others, but even the United States and Britain adopted many of these programs. Yet, what has shaken democracy, social democracy, in recent decades is a consequence of their collusion with capitalists to structure and maintain neocolonialism. After World War II, rather than putting into place through the World Bank and IMF programs that would enable newly independent colonies to gain wealth and develop their own countries, like the US did with the Marshall Plan for Europe, the US and Europe, including most social democrats, invoked an opposite plan for the colored world. They chained them with high interest rates and debts that sucked away their resources. Countries that resisted, like Vietnam and most recently Iraq, they invaded. In order to regain resources, some of these countries decided to go after market shares in the West by producing cheap consumer products at wages workers in the West would never accept. Corporations led by the US saw an opportunity to take advantage of the cheap labor in these developing countries and at the same time weaken social democrats and weaken labor unions at home so they could gain more political power and make even more money. So they moved factories out of Europe and the United States to places like Mexico, China, and Indonesia. And this decimated unions, undermined social democracy, and fed the rise of right-wing nationalism in Europe and the US. Conservatives in the West now blame China or immigrants for workers' economic problems. But the problem stems from widespread racism and exploitation of the quote-unquote third world in the first place. Not only by conservatives, but unions and social democrats joining in as well. Into this picture reemerges economic democracy. How do we move forward in New York without repeating past mistakes? We've begun in the de Blasio administration constructing prototypes for how to build economic democracy, and I encourage you to go to the later workshop that Christine Corella right here works on my staff will be in to talk about some of these initiatives, and Janelle Doris is here, head of our MWBE programs, and is also spearheading some of these initiatives. But I want to talk about one initiative we have underway to tackle these issues. And the important thing is we all work together and learn together. I'm not saying we figured everything out. No, we have not. We're just starting. One of our initiatives is to put a chip on the NYC ID card to enable online banking. We did an RFP, and we're reviewing proposals now. How does this connect with economic democracy? I'm going to tell you a few stories. For me, it begins with a problem I've been obsessed with for over 20 years. That is the problem, what I call building civic infrastructure, which boils down to funding community organizing, labor organizing, and popular education on a massive and ongoing scale. Moreover, funding it democratically, without strings and conditions on what people can work on or advocate. Foundation funding is sporadic and limited always, while government money has more strings than a harpsichord. That's why I think an entirely new model is needed in order to build political support for economic democracy, and I'll explain my journey in 4 parts. Part 1 is how I became interested in cooperatives with this in mind. And 20 years ago, I had a joint appointment at Columbia University in political science and business. And one evening, I went to a talk at the business school, which I fully expected to be boring. But a woman cooperative developer named Lynn Benander, who's sitting right there, from Western Mass, gave the talk that night. And what impressed me right away about Lynn was that she came to the talk in blue jeans and flip-flops. And the entire faculty, like the faculty were wearing business suits, pinstripe business suits. And Lynn started her talk by pulling out a guitar and singing a song. And I said, this woman clearly doesn't give a damn about what the faculty thinks about her, which was immediately appealing to me. And she described a co-op, I think it was in Colorado, where, I will call them hippies, where some hippies, 5,000 of them, organized to buy cell phone service together, collectively, in one contract, and the cell phone company paid them, I forget what it was, $400,000 or $600,000 a year for that contract. It occurred to me that this is a lot better and a lot easier to organize financing. If you want to finance organizing, this is a lot better way to do it than begging money from foundations. where they tell you what you can and can't do with the money. The hippies could do whatever they wanted with the money. It was their money. You could even put the money into political campaigns, like business does. It's their money. So, that was exciting. I was a light bulb. Part two, for me, happened a couple years after that. I met a group of Colombian radicals, literally, like revolutionaries who had to leave Colombia, South America. And they told me that they had just started a credit union for undocumented workers in North Carolina. And their strategy was to use the credit union not just to fund mortgages and small businesses, but to organize and educate the community around policy and politics. They said community banking was very non-threatening to conservatives, which was important for them since they were revolutionary radicals, immigrants in North Carolina. 10 years later, they had branches in 7 cities in the state. They financially supported over 50 Latino community organizations, and they had their own nonprofit public policy arm. So I learned that it's possible to use banking to fund community organizing and politics. Moreover, their bank, LCCU, Latino Community Credit Union, is one member, one vote. Every depositor is a member, and it is genuinely run democratically. Their banks celebrate diversity. When you walk in, they have flags, over 20 flags, representing every country where their members come from. Their banks have daycare right in the building so that members can come and hang out and take classes and learn stuff right at the bank and talk about whatever. LCCU was interested in collaborating with labor unions, of which there are not many in North Carolina. So I invited a large labor union secretary-treasurer that will remain nameless. The person's no longer secretary-treasurer, so don't start. I said, LCCU said to the union, if the union would deposit some of its strike funds or operating funds into their bank, which they needed, since they were growing so fast, they needed more money in the bank because they grew 100% a year every year. If they would do that, LCCU would organize entire Latino communities into the union. I thought this was a breakthrough. The union could expand into North Carolina without having to send in organizers and fighting it out in workplace after workplace, simply by redepositing some of their reserves from a corporate bank to a community-oriented bank, which is also FDIC insured. To my utter amazement, the secretary-treasurer of the union said that the union wasn't interested in co-ops. They put finance in one box and organizing in another box, and they weren't interested in innovating either box. I realized then we have a big internal problem. We have a lot of gatekeepers within our own movements that don't want to change how they think or how they operate. And nothing was going to change in a big way without a whole lot of re-education and debate in our own organizations. Part 3 started about 6 years ago. I was approached by someone from a large financial services company who said the company wants to become a, quote, social justice company. I said, this is a lot of bullshit. That's literally what I said. They said, no, really. We're serious. We're a technology company. We get a flat fee every time someone swipes a credit card, and we use our technology to see if the customer has money in their account to pay for their transaction within 7 seconds. So we're a volume business, like a restaurant. The more swipes we get, the more money we make. Rich people already use cards instead of cash, so we can't increase market share there. It's poor people worldwide who use cash all the time. So we have to become popular with poor people if we're going to grow. And we realize that this means we need to become identified with social justice. But we don't know how to do that. Can you help us? So I put them together with Local 1199 of Massachusetts. And at the time, they were struggling to figure out how they're going to collect dues because there had been a lawsuit called Harris versus Quinn, which said state governments can't deduct dues, union dues for home care workers from Medicaid, Medicare, which meant that the union would have to go knock on 50,000 doors in Massachusetts of elderly and disabled people and ask them to deduct union dues when their Medicaid, Medicare checks come in once a month. Not going to happen. So after 7 months of negotiations between the union and the company, which both sides said was a tremendous learning experience, the union and finance company created a bank card that was also a union ID card. It turned out that 90% of the home care workers were unbanked or underbanked, and most were paying huge fees to have their checks cashed or take out a loan or send money home to their family in Jamaica or Haiti, and they were using these payday loan shops and all that. The card they created had low fees, low charges for remittances, and many other features, all of which the union had negotiated. The finance company started collecting union dues for $11.99, since all the checks were deposited electronically. Moreover, the finance company showed us that they had data on every transaction. They could see block by block where people were using their cards to buy phone service, cable, diapers, food, everything. And it occurred to me that this data could be used to organize people in communities to buy many of these things as a group, like the hippies had done in Colorado. Moreover, we could ask the workers to contribute some amount, $5 or $10, out of every $100 they save from collective purchasing to fund continued organizing, policy advocacy, or politics. And in this way, we could get real money to build civic infrastructure with no strings attached. Part 4, last part, came out of Mississippi. A bunch of us, and I was at MIT at the time, had been working with the Mississippi NAACP for a decade. And the head of the state NAACP, Derek Johnson, who's national head now, wanted us to help him figure out how to better leverage black political power in the state. They had 60 mayors in the NAACP. One of my grad students, who happened to be an energy engineer, who now works for the city, went down to Mississippi to work with Derek. And what they discovered takes a little context. Much of Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia get their energy from the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was established by Roosevelt. The TVA operates huge dams that produce hydropower, and they distribute the power, because of Roosevelt, through rural electric cooperatives. What Derek and my former student discovered was that the electric co-ops were a main funding source for the Republican Party of Mississippi. And this meant that 8 majority black counties, black ratepayers were funding their political opposition and didn't even know it. Black mayors had seats on the boards of these co-ops ex officio, but they had never had any training on co-ops or the electrical system, and they didn't know that either that they were funding their opposition. The NAACP has now made taking over co-ops in these counties a top priority. And what I learned from this is that, one, government can do things at scale like Roosevelt did, which can be game-changing in terms of building co-ops or other kinds of economic democracy kinds of things. But there's nothing magic about a co-op that automatically makes it progressive. And you could say the same about a union. It takes a lot of education and staying on top of things to make that work. What we're hoping to do with the NYCD CHIP initiative is to put all these things together. We want to create a more affordable banking option for low-income communities in New York who really need it. But even more than this, we want community groups and unions to learn how to use big data from the card to organize people to do collective consumer purchasing and bargaining with corporations and utilities. We also want to encourage these groups to use some of the savings from community collective bargaining to fund civic infrastructure, and by that I mean organizing and advocacy. We think there's a lot of opportunity here. 12 years ago, NYCHA's Tenant Association got an offer of $32 million a year if NYCHA residents would agree to a single contract for their cable service. That's 12 years ago. There's real money here that could be used to start building a movement for economic democracy. There are a lot of things that will need to get worked out. It's a learning journey. How can groups participate? How will the money be divided? Who owns the data? But these are precisely what building a civic enterprise, particularly in the 21st century digital platform economy, entails. What I also like is that low-income people of color, this way, might actually have resources to have their own voices heard in policy and politics without censorship, without having better funded groups speaking for them, and without their own elected officials renting themselves out to donors. For all of us wanting economic democracy, honest dialogue and deep unity across race and geography, we need to have a rough level of equality and resources and capacity. Thank you for listening, and I'll look forward to the conversation.
So I think we'll do 10 minutes of Q&A. So if you have any questions for the Deputy Mayor, and only 10 minutes because we have to keep the show going. So, oh. Hello, hello.
Thank you very much. That was a really inspiring speech. What I would like to know is where can I get information on the financial institution that did that card with $11.99 and anything else that you had to say? I'm Deb Olson. I'm from Detroit, Center for Community-Based Enterprise.
Oh.
And working with another union trying to do something similar in terms of community union in Florida.
Well, you can go, you can talk to Christine Corello sitting right here, and she can give you details. You can also contact the LA Labor Federation or Local 2015, Home Care Workers of Los Angeles, which is doing a parallel strategy at a large scale. And they actually have 400 organizers going door to door explaining all this to workers and organizing people around it. Local 2015 LA Labor Federation, Rusty Hicks is head of it. 2015 is headed by April, or you could talk to LaFonza Butler, who's the former head of 2015 in LA. But they're doing it at a big scale. And Christine Corella is right here. She's sitting. Raise your hand, Christine. This lady right here. I'm recused. I can't talk about this stuff because since I know some of the players and we had an RFP, I can't I've stepped out of the process. Staff are selecting whoever's going to win this RFP, so I can't really get into it, but she can. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I had a question about the data aggregation and such that you're going to be doing by looking at consumer purchasing, and how that aggregate data is going to be managed and maintained, especially balancing the concerns that people would normally have about purchasing privacy and balancing that with their ability to engage in collective economic change.
So safety is critical, and actually all of the institutions I mentioned, the Latino Community Credit Union represent documented workers. The home care workers in New England I worked with, half of them are undocumented. So security is a perennial concern, and that's one of the reasons why we're carefully evaluating chip technology, because it's a lot more secure. Most where the real danger is actually in terms of security for a lot of folks is with their phone. In terms of that is not nearly as secure, or going to a hospital where they collect your information, that data stuff is not nearly as secure. So we are doing, and Christine can tell you in some detail, we're going through a lot of different things to make sure that people's privacy is protected. Otherwise, none of this works or makes sense. But this approach is actually more secure for most people than any other option we could think of.
Hey, I'm Jessica Gordon-Nemhard at John Jay College. I have a political question, which you might not want to answer, but I'm wondering if you have a plan to to make the discretionary, what is it, 1.3 billion for worker co-op development money that's coming out of city council to make it a
You
line
said 1.3
item.
what?
Million, sorry.
Million.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Wishful thinking, right, that it's a billion. Anyway, it's discretionary right now from city council. I'm wondering if you guys have any plans to make it a line item permanent funding.
We'd like to. We'd like to actually do, we'd actually like, I call that 1.3 million micro co-ops. We actually, and we need that, that's a grassroots approach, but we actually, we're a $90 billion a year operation. We do $20 billion a year in procurement contracts. We actually want to build large scale co-ops leveraging our procurement power, and we want to partner MWBEs and local co-ops with some established bigger operations like Mondragon companies or others to come in and manufacture things in New York. But we want the Mondragon companies or whatever, these bigger ones, to be junior partners in partnerships and do capacity building and so forth with our MWBEs or our local co-ops here. And by the way, a majority woman or a majority of color MWBE can be a co-op, right? So that's where we're moving, and we want to put a lot more resources than 1.3 million and justify it to say this is creating jobs at scale. And actually, it's better than some of these giveaways that we do for other ventures, et cetera. So we're going down that path. And we're not even viewing our big co-op thing as really through the council discretionary thing. We actually have a lot of other approaches that we're trying to push on. And by the way, Janelle does $3.6 billion a year in MWBE contracts. We're pushing for legislation to raise our discretionary power for these contracts, which used to be 20,000. Then a few years ago, it went up to 150,000. Mayor de Blasio 2 weeks ago said, no, I want to take it to $1 million. So we can actually give $1 million grants or contracts to companies that we want to help institute, create, get going at $1 million level a pop, not 1.3 million for the whole city for a whole year. We're trying to go in a different way.
One more question?
My name is Oksana, Housing Policy Analyst of the Community Service. I was wondering if you could speak to any housing policies or models that fit into the economic democracy framework and where the city is moving in that.
Well, that's a great question. And in my view, we got to create a new ecosystem on the housing and development front. And so, I know there's going to be someone later talking about co-op city. How is it that labor 50 years ago could do 70,000 units with pension funds, and today they can't protect their members from being evicted, right? That doesn't make any sense. I know unions in New York whose pension funds were going to the REITs, real estate trusts, that were investing in Trump. And Trump was then using workers' own money to evict them. Stuyvesant City, which had a proposal to become a co-op, they got beat out by Tishman Speyer when they bought it out in 2006, $5.2 billion. All but 29 million of the 5.2 billion came from pension funds, NICERS, the Ontario public sector workers, CalPERS, of which SEIU is the biggest voter, and the Singapore Investment Trust and the Anglican Church of England. They got 5.2 billion from all these people, and then in their pro forma, they said we're going to evict workers out of Stuyvesant City, and the unions let that go. So we have to do a lot of education amongst ourselves. We got to build institutions ourselves to actually move development in a different way. So I've started talking to HIPBIT, which are the pension funds of the building trades, who actually get this and I've been saying to them, look, we're rebuilding NYCHA in New York City. We need you. We gotta fund it differently, because where you get your money is where you get your results. right? And workers have enough money, if they decide to control it and use it, to actually build affordable housing for workers in New York City. And it's not just about how much subsidy can we squeeze out. We will never solve our housing crisis through subsidies. You know, we got to do rent regulation at the state level. And by the way, we now have a black-led state Senate, a black-led assembly, a majority of color city council, and zero agenda. Zero agenda. And we don't even have any institution that's creating an agenda. We have no process for that at all in New York City. So frankly, the problem we're having with affordable housing is this stuff I was talking about before. When I said unions and other organizations staying in the box, not willing to go out of the box, that's our problem.